So that's where we've got to in terms of the international law framework. Another treaty provision, human rights treaty provision that supports the democratic ideal, or has been argued to do so, is Common Article 1 to the two named human rights treaties, the Civil and Fiscal Covenant and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Article 1 proclaims the right to self-determination, including the right of the people to, and the quote is, freely determine their political status. So this will be understood as a sort of collective right to democracy. But although there is this recognition then in the human rights treaties of the right to participate in public life, these texts of international law offer a rather limited account of democracy, associating it primarily with periodic elections. So outside these human rights instruments, there was very little interest in the relationship of international law to democracy really until the end of the Cold War, when it seemed that Western forms of democracy had triumphed. Indeed, this led the scholar Francis Biennial famously to proclaim the end of history. He argued that the events of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on, marked a possible, and I quote from him here, endpoint in mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The final form of human government. They were very bold words. Now, this type of Cold War, end of Cold War euphoria, did inspire some international lawyers, almost all of them American, to discern a right to democracy in international law. For example, the upright fight sober Thomas Frank wrote in softly religious tones about the rise and rise of the democratic entitlement in a famous article that was published in 1992. Now, enter then James Crawford. His inaugural lecture at Cambridge University, when he took up the dual chair in international law there, was delivered very early in the time, in 1993. James's lecture was titled Democracy in International Law, and it brought a dose of cool reasoning to the overheated debate. James began his lecture by noting that democracy seemed to do better than other forms of government at peacefully resolving disputes. So he surmised it must be worth trying to reinforce democratic government through international law institutions as one way of eliminating war. But then he went on in his lecture to describe a relatively thin enthusiasm for democracy in international law. There was, for example, no requirement in international law that the government of the country should be democratically elected. Indeed, as James pointed out in his lecture, international law itself has many undemocratic features because it focuses on the cascade of the state and not its inequality. For example, international law assumes that the executive has plenary powers with respect to foreign affairs, without reference to the effect that this will have on individuals. Also, he pointed out in international law, domestic law, national legal systems, even if democratically established, cannot justify the failure to comply with international obligations. This phenomenon we know in Australia and elsewhere has often been called the democratic deficit of international law. The fact that, at least from an international law perspective, its rules override those of nationally elected government. On the other hand, James noted in his lecture, the principles of territorial sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of states were readily invoked to screen undemocratic government actions from scrutiny. Now, James's lecture struck me again when I reread it recently, was brilliant and subtle, running an argument that he later described as modified skepticism about the role of the democratic principle in international law. Now, some American supporters of the right to democracy in international law have argued that, well, if democracy is supported by international law, there must be a duty on states to promote democracy, even if necessary through military intervention. Now, James in his lecture registered his disapproval with such a proposition, and the major cases of pro-democratic investment, we can call it such when James was giving his lecture, were the US invasions of Grenada and Panama. First, he said this doesn't seem a very plausible proposition because those pro-democratic invasions, or apparently purportedly pro-democratic invasions, were not widely accepted among the international community. And then also, he pointed out, the right to intervene was typically exercised in an arbitrary way, rather than invade Panama, but not Chile, for example. Also, he pointed to the sheer impracticality of installing democracy through a foreign intervention, and the fact that assuming the legality of pro-democratic invasion would deprive the supposed beneficiaries of the invasion the chance to air their own views. Now, folks, that's, I think, a very important contribution to the debate about democracy international law. And later on, in the 90s, James published a later paper written with his PhD student, now colleague and another Australian international lawyer, Susan Marks. And in this paper that James and Susan wrote together, James's scepticism about the value of supporting democracy explicitly in international law seems to have deepened. And that paper set out the pitfalls of the proposed norm of democratic governance and cautioned against the division of the world into a legitimate democratic path and an illegitimate undemocratic path. So what I'd like to do is to draw on some of the themes that James identified to reflect on where international law is now with respect to democracy, almost 15 years after his inaugural lecture. His work, I think, in the 1990s was remarkably prescient in foreshadowing the difficulties that the democratic principle would face. So first of all, since 1993, since his lecture, I think the controversy over the definition of what is democracy has deepened. James noted that problem, but there has really been an exacerbation, I think, of these problems. The term democracy has become an explicit battleground